Marbury versus Madison is one of the most important Supreme Court cases that we're going to learn about in class this year. And the reason why it is so important is that this case established the constitutional principle judicial review. So, what is judicial review? Judicial review is the idea that the federal courts, which include the Supreme Court, but also lower federal courts across the country, have the power to tell us what the Constitution means. And by that, they can then strike down laws or executive orders or things that state governments do as unconstitutional, which just means it violates the Constitution and they're not allowed to do that anymore. Okay, this has happened many times where the Supreme Court has made a ruling and then certain laws across the country now are void, meaning they can't be enforced anymore. Okay, and remember, this happens in the court system. So someone has to sue, it has to work its way up to the courts, and then they make a ruling. Okay, doesn't happen during the lawmaking process. So, how did this case create judicial review? I'm going to give you a super quick rundown. So, this is during one of the first administrations that we had early in the country, and a man by the name of Marbury. He is appointed to a federal judgeship right before the previous president is leaving office. Okay, so President Adams is just about to leave office. He appoints a bunch of federal judges. Marbury is one of them. Okay, but he doesn't get the actual commission because you write it out on a piece of paper. It doesn't physically get sent to Marbury. He leaves them on the Secretary of State's desk. The Secretary of State under President Adams is John Marshall. Okay, so now fast forward a little bit with the also John Adams appoints John Marshall as Supreme Court Justice. Okay, so President Jefferson is elected and becomes president. Okay, now President Jefferson says, we're not going to deliver any of those commissions. You didn't deliver it, so it isn't going to happen. Okay, so the new Secretary of State is now James Madison, and he refuses to give Marbury his commission because he's like, you didn't get it under the previous administration, so now I'm tearing it up. Okay. Marbury asks for a type of document called a writ of mandamus, which basically just means you have to give me that piece of paper. Okay. So they end up suing about this. Okay. And the case goes straight to the Supreme Court. Okay. So now John Marshall, who was the person who didn't make sure that those documents were sent, he's now the one that's hearing the case because he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he rules that basically the Supreme Court doesn't have any jurisdiction here, meaning they could not hear that case first. And so therefore they cannot issue the writ of mandamus because they do not have jurisdiction. Okay, so jurisdiction just means that they have the power to hear a case, okay, that they have the authority. And he is saying that there was this specific law that was written by Congress previously called the Judiciary Act of 1789, and that law is unconstitutional because it violates what the Constitution says. So, by striking down this law and saying this law cannot be in effect because it violates the Constitution, John Marshall basically has created the principle of judicial review. Okay. Before that, the Supreme Court had never stricken down a law in the past. So that is why this case is important. It's because this case created the idea that courts can, in fact, strike down laws.